Good afternoon. This is Geography 130, Lecture 21. We have almost reached the end of the semester, as I'm sure you're well aware. This week we are reading basically two things. There's a little bit of Conley as well, but not very much. For today, I asked you to read an essay by David Harvey from 1974 called Population, Resources, and the Ideology of Science. That will be the focus today, principally, although I'll touch on Conley a little bit as well, the chapter from last week that I wasn't able to discuss very thoroughly in lecture. And for Thursday, I've asked you to read a fairly lengthy essay by Amartya Sen, published in the New York Review of Books about 15 or 16 years ago. These are essentially the conclusions of the class. Harvey's essay might be seen as the conclusion from a theoretical point of view. Amartya Sen's essay represents the conclusion from an empirical point of view, and to some degree from an ethical point of view. In fact, both of these essays touch on issues of ethics. But I would strongly encourage you to read both of these essays carefully and to view them or to think about them in light of the rest of the semester. Ask yourselves what conclusions these two readings give us. Ask yourselves how they relate to the readings we have read so far, the ideas we've discussed, and to really try to chew on these in some detail. I think if you do that, you will have, like I say, gotten the sort of core points from the semester. The reading for today is considerably harder, I think, than the reading for Thursday, reflecting its more theoretical orientation. So I'm going to try to focus and try to get a discussion going today about the arguments that Harvey makes. Okay? Are there any questions or housekeeping matters? I've gotten some questions about the final exam. I don't really have more to add to what I offered in answer to that question last time. Actually, one other thing I should make a point of, and I'll put it in the lecture for Thursday. The notice I've gotten indicates that the final exam is going to take place in two different rooms. Two different rooms in Dwinelle. I'm not sure why. Maybe they're connected to each other. I honestly don't know yet. But I will try to make that explicit and hopefully sort out any issues related to that next time. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted you to repeat.
Oh, you want me to repeat what I said last time? I believe what I said last time is that the final exam will include one section with short answer type questions where you're asked to provide a definition or clarify something that probably only take a sentence or two. It will also include a series of sort of short essay, sort of one paragraph, maybe two paragraph type answers. And there will also be a longer essay that might take you 6 to 8 paragraphs to answer. In the past, I've also frequently chosen a newspaper article and included it in the exam and asked you to read it and then ask some questions about how it might be related to or interpreted through some of the key readings from the semester, that kind of thing.
Is that for the longer essay or for the shorter essay?
That's frequently a section of its own that amounts to probably a kind of shorter, maybe medium-length essay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, David Harvey, his 1974 essay. Remember that this was written in the midst of the events described in the later parts of Conley, at a time when scares about population were near the top of a number of agendas, environmental agendas, international development agendas. Apart from a few comments he makes about China, the essay, I think, has stood the test of time extremely well. And I want to try to get, not just review his argument, but actually get into the details of it and make sure that this is clear. Harvey is a very prominent geographer. He has written a lot of things since then. This is one of his earlier essays. So he says in there, towards the beginning, I'm arguing that the use of a particular scientific method is of necessity founded in ideology, and that any claim to be ideology-free is of necessity an ideological claim. Any questions about that? What's he saying here? He's got this right up front. Yeah? Okay, the choice of a method is never neutral, and the claim that your method is somehow neutral is itself an ideological claim. So he's confronting quite directly the question of the relationship of science to ethics, science to society. He's suggesting that there is no such thing as a science that is purely objective and without some kind of reference to ideological claims. Do you buy that? Isn't this what science prides itself on? Isn't this precisely what sets science apart in the eyes of most people? That it is objective, impartial, that it is simply interested in what is and makes no claim to explain what ought to be or to make normative claims based on science? Yeah?
This is kind of a hard opinion to disagree with, because basically saying that no matter what somebody says, it's going to be subjective. People are inherently subjective, and that kind of global claim is an ideology itself that's just kind of hard to either you believe it or you don't.
Okay, either you believe this or you don't. His argument itself is obviously, by his own argument, subject to his subjective position, his ethical perspectives or values. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure. Let me try to translate. Perhaps, does this mean that scientific claims are really only objective to the extent that everyone else decides to agree with them? So a peer review process in which an argument or an article or data are subjected to other people's presumably neutral or at least anonymous scrutiny should it assure that the claims are grounded in something other than just subjective opinions? Is that... He says scientific inquiry cannot proceed in an ethically neutral manner. Agreed? Yeah. Okay, if the scientific method involves establishing or putting out a hypothesis, which is an idea, and your goal is to maybe not prove it but disprove it, right? That's the scientific method. And you're suggesting that insofar as this is an idea, it has to be or it can't avoid being ideological. Any thoughts? Any further thoughts? The real problem, he says, lies in the ideology of scientific method itself. Yeah.
Well, in a previous class, we talked about how a lot of the major scientific discoveries have been based a large part on intuition or everything but the scientific method. So, I don't know, it seems like some of the great scientists didn't follow the ideology of the scientific method, so maybe it's not even worthwhile.
Some of the great insights of science come from intuitions that may or may not have been the result of the scientific method itself. And therefore, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the last point.
Well, I mean, it just poses a critique to the universality of the scientific method.
Okay, critique of the universality of the scientific method, the idea that it produces knowledge that somehow stands alone, independently, transcending all circumstances. Yes?
What's subjective is what we choose to study and how they interpret the results. But what they observe is continuously repeated by multiple scientific experiments, then you can show that it is objective. But how they interpret that or what they choose to study is different.
Okay, so you can see sort of separate moments in the scientific method. One that is clearly subject to subjectivity, but another that is grounded in, say, replicable experiments, data that can be demonstrated by other people and that therefore is objective. Okay, how about you?
I don't know if you're including that last statement, the fact that your findings don't exist in and of itself, but they're then used by other people to support their own claims. But that would also just like a fact in itself is nothing without interpretation.
A fact in and of itself is nothing without, I mean, it moves by being interpreted and traveling and used by other people. Yeah.
It seems like certain disciplines like the hard sciences might be more tend towards objectivity, that there's less ideology playing through. The standpoint of no one's really, really intent on gravity being the case or something like that, whereas international relations is based on ideas that are not necessarily proven.
Okay. So different disciplines or different questions might be subject to different degrees of objectivity or subjectivity. So you're suggesting that the law of gravity, for example, or the study of the law of gravity, is not something in which people are likely to have a great deal of personal interests invested, whereas something like international relations, there might be a lot of subjectivity clearly involved, at least insofar as it's about subjective things, right, or things with which people have a great deal of personal interests. Yeah. Okay.
So like other systems of maybe not even objectively concerning ecosystems or things of that nature, they're not valid, so they're not, it's not even like they're dismissed as ideology, we just look at it and try to develop it in a Western way.
So the ideological part is the belief that this way, this scientific method, produces knowledge that's somehow better, different from and better than other kinds of ways of arriving at knowledge. And this, I mean, this would speak to your suggestion. I mean, we could put those two together. I think Harvey is actually saying that no matter what you're studying, there is this dependence, there is an ideological aspect to all science. And and I don't think he's necessarily trying to say that that makes them all bad, or that it renders them somehow invalid. I mean, he might agree that other kinds of ways of producing knowledge deserve greater respect than they frequently get. I think he's aiming this very much at scientists themselves and saying, look, you can't pretend, you can't claim that your method is ideologically free or neutral, that claim in and of itself, insofar as it tries to elevate scientific knowledge to some kind of special status, necessarily means that you are making ideological claims or expecting to benefit from certain kinds of perceptions about your knowledge that are themselves ideological. Now, this gets into some very tricky questions about exactly what objective and subjective mean. And that's, in a sense, what we are getting to. But the point about different disciplines is also critical here, because what he's going to argue is that this problem, this question of human population in relationship to natural resources, is a question that demands a certain kind of method, and that it demands a method different from the one that is typically used. And he's particularly going to zero in on what's considered to be the sort of standard definition of the scientific method itself. I don't think he's saying the scientific method never works, or it has no validity of any kind, even though he is saying that it is itself ideological and can't avoid being ideological. Rather, I think he's saying your method has to fit the questions you are trying to answer. The issues themselves have an effect on what kinds of methods are the right ones to use or the best ones to use. And what he's going to suggest is that the standard notion of the scientific method is not adequate to this set of questions. And that really is, at the end of the day, the strongest single conclusion I would suggest we can draw from this subject, is that if you are concerned about natural resources and environmental problems related to human use, that you have got to choose a method for thinking about them that is adequate to the complexity of the problem. And that the standard scientific method is not adequate to the complexity of the problem. And one of the things that's come up over and over and over again is the problem of empirical validation for a Malthusian perspective, right? On the one hand, it would seem that you can find all kinds of empirical evidence for the notion that population growth creates various kinds of environmental problems, right? It seems obvious. On the other hand, the empirical predictions and claims that have been made for the Malthusian theory have repeatedly failed to materialize. The population of the world is 2, 4, 6, 10 times larger than it was projected at various points in the last 200 years. And yet the cataclysmic sort of outcome that Malthus predicted, or that his theory indicated was inevitable, still has not yet quite materialized, right? We've seen that there is no simple, stable relationship between population numbers and various other indexes or measurements of economic growth, environmental circumstances, any number of other ways we might choose to try to link population numbers to the outcomes frequently attributed to population growth. So let's try to make sense of this argument. What method would be adequate? Harvey says, if the dominant method of logical empiricism inevitably produces Malthusian or neo-Malthusian results, then we can more easily understand how it is that scientists raised in the tradition of logical empiricism have, when they have turned to the population resources question, inevitably attributed a certain veracity to the Malthusian and Neo-Malthusian view. So he's suggesting that the method itself invariably produces these kinds of outcomes, these conclusions. That constructing the world in the pursuit of knowledge in a logical empirical fashion sort of preordains that the outcome you reach will be, generally speaking, a Malthusian or Neo-Malthusian outcome. Now, that in and of itself presumably ought to raise questions for us, right? If your method produces a certain kind of outcome, no matter what, then there's a potential sort of circularity and a potential problem in the approach itself. This method broadly assumes that there are two kinds of truths, which we may call logical truths. They are correct deductions from certain initial statements. And empirical truths. They are correct and verifiable factual statements which reflect observation and experiment. Logical truths may be related to empirical truths by uniting the two kinds of statements in a hypothetico-deductive system. So let's think about Malthus. Where does he start? Does he start from empirical truths or logical truths? Where does he start? Everyone remember? What are the two postulata? Yes, well, okay. He says the tendency to reproduce will not diminish. And he says we need food. We have to eat, and we will unavoidably procreate. Are those logical or empirical? Can we verify them by observation?
They seem to be logical, at least the first one, because he says that the tendency to reproduce will not diminish, and that's not necessarily empirically true.
Okay, the tendency to reproduce will not diminish is not necessarily empirically true. I mean, it does sort of follow from the nature of humans, I suppose.
I mean, it's affected by all these other causes.
It's affected by all these other causes. Factors, what does he go on to do? He deduces things from these two postulata, right? And he adds in the claims about the capacity of the earth to, or the capacity of the land to produce more food, and the rate at which population growth will accelerate, the compounding factor or compounding characteristic of these growth rates. Yeah?
Isn't at least his food postulata pretty accurate?
Yes, you need food to live. I think that is accurate. And as far as we know, the tendency, actually, he said, doesn't he put it as the mutual attraction between the sexes or something will not diminish? Which I suppose we can safely assume that that's true, even if the rate at which it results in babies may change. So perhaps we should just say these are sort of irrefutable claims, right? It seems almost pointless to try to refute them. It does seem a little bit like trying to refute the law of gravity. And from there, we get the kind of intuitive power of a Malthusian perspective. Empiricism assumes that objects can be understood independently of observing subjects. Truth is therefore assumed to lie in a world external to the observer whose job it is to record and faithfully reflect the attributes of objects. This, I think, is actually the core of Harvey's argument, is this claim, that the world is made up of objects that are external to the observer and that are independent of the observer's act of observing them, and that since everyone can observe them equally, they are independent of the personal opinions of the people looking at them. Does this align with the leading thinking in science? Physics, for example. Okay. This is this 20th century major insight in physics. You can't look at an object without changing it. The act of observing it in and of itself will change the object. There is no such thing as an object that is independent of the person looking at it. Is that true of population? What happens when we look at population? Pardon? You want to control it. Is that? What do you do when you look at population? What have we seen this semester about population? Population, I mean, it's in the name of the course, for crying out loud. It's a major category. It's organizing our thought. It's organizing our decision to even be here in this room. This category of population, yes. And how it affects natural resources? So when we look at population, it changes the effects on natural resources? Okay, all right. Part of the concept of population for purposes of this course is that it has a relationship to natural resources. And therefore, they're interesting to study together. Yeah. Okay, when you look at a population, you define a population. You say there is such a thing as a population. After all, I'm looking at it. Or I'm thinking about it. Did you have your hand up back there in the corner? Did you have your hand up? No, okay, sorry. And we have seen this. Yeah. Okay, the census is ongoing right now, and it is a very complicated, large-scale, structured, systematic effort to count all the people in the country and arrive at objective figures about the U.S. population broken down into all kinds of different categories, which in turn enables or feeds into all manner of issues in government, decisions about budgets, decisions about allocating representatives to Congress, that kind of thing. Did you have something? So thinking about population has very significant consequences in the real world. It does, in fact, change, if not the numbers,